The problem of forgetting. Ancient Egypt's greatest achievement wasn't the pyramids. This is not a metaphor for ambition or architectural prowess. The pyramids remain visible, studied, debated across millennia. But there is something beneath that achievement that matters far more profoundly. Ancient Egypt's greatest achievement was remembering. Specifically, it was remembering how to build. Any civilization can create wonders. We see this pattern repeating through history. A culture rises, summons its genius, manufactures something extraordinary, a monument, a technique, a body of knowledge that seems to justify all the struggle of its existence. And then often within a generation or two, that knowledge evaporates. The capability vanishes. The next generation looks at what their ancestors built and cannot comprehend how it was accomplished. They can replicate the form, but the understanding that preceded the form has somehow dissolved into silence. History is littered with such losses. Roman concrete, a material of such sophisticated engineering that modern chemistry took centuries to reverse engineer its principles. Greek fire, a weapon whose exact composition and method remain unknown despite detailed contemporary descriptions. Damascus steel, a technique that produced blades of such superior quality that later armorers could not match them, despite possessing the same raw materials. These are not myths. These are confirmed historical records of capabilities that vanished because no one wrote them down correctly, or wrote them down but could not preserve the living understanding that would allow later readers to interpret what was written. Egypt avoided this trap. This is not pride speaking. This is the testimony of their own records and the testimony of history itself. Egypt maintained cultural continuity for 3 millennia longer than any empire before or since. 3,000 years. Consider that span. The distance from ancient Egypt to ourselves is approximately the same distance backward from our own time. We struggle to comprehend societies just 2 centuries removed. The Egyptians sustained a coherent civilization stretching back 30 of those centuries. How did they succeed where others failed? What was the difference? They understood something we have largely forgotten in our modern urgency for innovation and progress. Knowledge without careful preservation disappears within a single generation. Not knowledge as facts. Facts can be rediscovered. But knowledge as understanding, as the conceptual framework that makes isolated facts cohere into wisdom. That kind of knowledge is fragile. It dies when the people who understand it stop being there to transmit it to those who don't. The god who taught them this lesson, whom they called Thoth, wasn't worshipped for his power in the traditional sense. He was not feared like other gods. He did not command storms or shake the earth. He was not placated through blood sacrifice or appeased through ritual submission. He was revered for his perfect memory, for his capacity to preserve, for his understanding that the universe itself depends on continuous attentive observation and exact record. As you settle into this ancient world, allow me to ask you to consider something. If your own civilization left only one principle behind, only one truth carved into stone for whatever consciousness might eventually inherit this world, what would you want it to be? What single teaching would you trust to contain enough meaning to guide a lost future? This is not a rhetorical gesture. The Egyptians asked themselves this question genuinely, and their answer shaped everything that followed. The opening of silence. Before the first stone was laid at Giza, before Memphis rose along the Nile's western bank, with its temples and administrative complexes, Before any monument was conceived, the ancient Egyptians understood their world as emerging from something they called none. Not merely water, not merely the physical substance we understand water to be. None was potential itself, a possibility in its most primordial form. The pyramid texts carved into burial chambers of the 5th and 6th dynasties describe this primordial state with careful precision. Boundless, they say, dark, without erection, without direction. And these words are important because they tell us how the ancients conceived of existence at its origin. Neither sky nor earth existed in that state. Not because they would come later, but because the very distinction between earth and sky was not yet meaningful. No above, no below, no forward, no back. Only a possibility drifted there, formless and patient, waiting for something to occur that none could predict, because time itself had not yet emerged to create the category of prediction. In this quiet expanse, creation did not explode into being. This is crucial to understand because most cultures imagine creation as violence, as rupture, as something emerging through conflict and force. But the Egyptian texts suggest something stranger, something more unsettling. Creation did not explode. It thought itself into existence. This is not poetic metaphor. This is their literal description of how ordered reality emerged from formless potential. The earliest cosmologies recorded in temple walls suggest that from this stillness, the first gods arose. But they did not arise as personalities, not as beings with desires and ambitions and emotional complexity. They arose as principles. Light learned to define itself, not merely to exist, but to understand that it was separate from darkness, to recognize the boundary between illumination and shadow. Waters understood their boundaries, not merely to flow, but to recognize that they were distinct from land, that there was a boundary between fluid and solid. Cycles began their eternal repetition. Not merely to occur, but to recognize that occurrence could be measured, could be counted, could be anticipated. And as these forces stabilized, as the universe began to hold its shape, began to maintain coherence rather than collapse back into formless potential, something essential became clear, something almost mathematical in its logic. Order without structure would collapse. Time without measurement would scatter like wind over water. Truth without record would vanish like breath in desert wind, present one moment and utterly gone the next, with no trace of what had been. It was from this necessity that Thoth emerged, not from divine will asserting itself, not from the cosmic drama that characterized other gods' origins. The inscriptions do not describe him arriving with thunder or flame. No battle announced his presence. No cataclysmic moment marked his entrance into the narrative of creation. Instead, the texts present him as awareness itself taking form, consciousness crystallizing into purpose, as if the universe, having emerged into order, suddenly needed to know itself to witness what it had become, to verify that the order it had assumed would hold. Where other gods embodied motion, the sun's relentless journey, the flooding river, the fertile soil, Thoth embodied understanding. He was the answer to a question the cosmos had asked at the moment of its stabilization. How do we remember what we've become? How do we ensure that this order, this coherence, does not dissolve back into formlessness? The answer was not force. It was attention. The moon that measures. The astronomical ceilings at Dendera Temple show Thoth's association with lunar cycles with remarkable clarity. Not the sun's journey across the sky, not the heat that commands growth and withers in equal measure. Thoth was associated with the moon's softer light, the glow that measures rather than commands, the light that watches. This distinction is not incidental. It is fundamental to understanding what the Egyptians believed Thoth represented. While Ra, the sun god, blazed across the heavens, bringing heat and life and the authority of visible dominion, Thoth governed the moon's quiet journey. Night after night, the moon returns. It grows full and becomes invisible, and grows full again in a cycle so regular that it measures time itself. Weeks are marked by lunar phases. Months are named for the moon's progression. The calendar hangs on the moon's shoulders, though few people consciously recognize this dependency. His light did not overwhelm. This is what matters most. The moon's light reveals through permitting vision without dominating. You can see by moonlight, but you see gently, indirectly. Details are illuminated but not harshly. The landscape becomes visible without being scorched. And Thoth's role in cosmic order was precisely this, to permit consciousness to see what is without, the harsh certainty that would leave no room for nuance, complexity, or the understanding that truth often contains multiple valid perspectives when examined carefully. In these early ages, when the framework of reality was still settling, when the distinction between order and chaos was recent and fragile, Thoth began his work. This is where the temple calendars preserved from the Middle Kingdom become essential sources. They reveal a civilization engaged in sophisticated astronomical calculations, tracking not just days and years, but moments patterns, the intricate dance between celestial bodies and terrestrial cycles. The priests listened to existence itself and learned its rhythm. This phrase appears repeatedly in the Egyptian texts, and it is worth pausing over. They did not impose structure on reality. They did not attempt to force the universe into categories humans found convenient. They recognized the structure that was already there. This is observation as spiritual discipline, attention as prayer. The belief that if you listen carefully enough to how things actually are, that listening itself constitutes a form of worship. Some traditions recorded in the coffin texts suggest that Thoth spoke the first true words. But these were not sounds for commanding or for celebrating. They were words of definition. To name something was to stabilize it in the fabric of creation. The moment you say, this is light and this is dark, the moment you distinguish between them linguistically, you have begun the process of making that distinction real, of giving it permanence in the realm of consciousness and understanding. To write it was to give it permanence beyond the moment of speech. Speech dissolves. The voice carries the words, and then silence returns, and the words are gone unless someone remembers them. But to write something, to inscribe it in permanent form, to create marks that will endure after the speaker has died, this is to transform the temporary into the eternal. And in this transformation, Thoth found his true purpose. The keeper of boundaries. In this way, Thoth became what the Egyptians needed most. The foundation beneath the visible world. The silent principle that prevented reality from unraveling back into formless potential. The priests who copied these texts understood him as an observer before he was an actor. Observation is the fundamental act. Action follows only after one has observed clearly what is. When gods quarreled over territory or tribute, and the mythological texts record such conflicts frequently, Thoth did not choose sides with passion. He did not favor one deity over another. When chaos threatened the boundaries between order and dissolution, when the delicate structure of creation trembled, he did not panic. He did not respond with force or cunning or emotional reaction. He watched. He recorded. He understood. The Egyptians believed something that we have largely abandoned in modern thinking. Balance was not achieved through force. It was achieved through clarity, through seeing what is precisely as it is without the distortion of desire, without the editing that serves preferred narratives, without the convenient blindness that allows us to overlook contradictions in our own positions. Clarity was sacred, not as an abstract ideal, but as a practical necessity. In the sacred literature, Thoth carries a palette and stylus. These are the tools of a scribe. But reading the text carefully reveals that these are not merely tools, not mere instruments of craft. They represent something deeper, something metaphysical. They represent the capacity to make thought permanent, to transform the invisible into the enduring, to give form to that which exists only in consciousness, and through that giving of form, to stabilize it in reality. Every movement of the stars charted and recorded becomes available for prediction and understanding. Every principle governing life and death written down becomes a law that the universe must follow consistently. Every truth that separated creation from void inscribed became a boundary that chaos could not cross. All of it required witness. All of it required record. And Thoth became that witness, the universe's scribe, the consciousness that saw, measured, and wrote down what was seen. As the Nile established its rhythm flooding and receding with patterns, the early Egyptians learned to predict with increasing accuracy. Thoth watched these cycles with particular attention. The Nilometers carved into temple walls show how carefully the ancients measured water levels, how precisely they calculated the relationship between celestial events and terrestrial floods. When Sirius rose at dawn at a particular season, the flooding would begin. Not randomly, not variably, but with reliable consistency. And this reliability was not given. It had to be observed, calculated, verified, and recorded so that future generations could benefit from the knowledge accumulated by their ancestors. This was not superstition. This was applied observation, and it reflected Thoth's essential nature perfectly. Life obeyed hidden rules. Time followed invisible architecture, and someone needed to preserve those rules to document that architecture, to protect what the Egyptians called Ma'at, truth balance, cosmic harmony. Without Ma'at, the creation hymns tell us repeatedly the world would collapse. The guardian against unmaking. Without Ma'at, darkness would reclaim form. The careful boundaries between order and chaos would dissolve. The distinctions that made existence comprehensible would blur back into the formlessness from which they had emerged. And so Thoth came to be understood not only as a god of wisdom or a god of writing, but as a guardian against unmaking, as the intellect that stood between order and its opposite, the witness who prevented reality from forgetting its own structure. In the stillness of night, when the moon traced its silver arc across the sky, Thoth's presence was believed to intensify. The world rested, but he remained awake, watching, counting, remembering every detail that the daylight had revealed. The astronomical observations recorded in temple archives suggest that priests understood themselves as continuing this work. They too were awake when others slept. They too were measuring the heavens with the same care that Thoth had measured the first moments of creation. Imagine standing at the edge of those earliest nights. No cities yet marked the desert. No monuments rose from the sand. No voices had named the stars. Only wind over water and the infinite quiet of a world still learning what it meant to exist. In that silence, consciousness itself was listening not for prayers or offerings or requests, but for meaning. Not for worship in the traditional sense, but for truth. Truth that could stabilize itself against the entropy that constantly threatened to dissolve it. And as creation continued to stabilize, as gods assumed their roles, and the stage was set for humanity's eventual emergence in the distant future, Thoth remained distinct among the divine. Not distant in the sense of cold or uncaring, but different. Different in kind. Shaped less by mythic drama and more by deliberate purpose. His role was not to combat chaos with weapons, not to seduce or transform or orchestrate fate. His role was to witness, to record, to preserve. The origin stories preserved in various temple traditions do not agree on how Thoth came into being. Some texts contradict others. Some describe his emergence in terms that seem mutually exclusive with descriptions found in other sources. And the Egyptians reading these varied accounts did not attempt to harmonize them, or to declare one correct and the others false. Instead, they seem to accept the ambiguity. And that ambiguity feels appropriate for a god of wisdom. Mystery, after all, was never a flaw in their understanding. It was an invitation. Some texts suggest Thoth emerged directly from the heart of creation, self-born and self-aware, formed by the universe's need to understand itself. Others describe him as born from the mind of Ra, not through physical generation, but through thought. Intelligence made independent, reason given voice and form. Still other traditions place his birth beneath the moon itself, where reflected light shaped him rather than fire. The Egyptians linked Thoth intimately with the lunar cycle, recognizing in the moon a perfect symbol of his nature. The moon does not dominate the sky. It observes. It changes, yet returns. It governs time, gently marking months and tides and the rhythms that life quietly follows. Where Ra ruled the day with brilliant certainty, Thoth ruled the night with contemplation. The measurement of time. And it was this contemplative authority, this power, that came not from command, but from understanding, that would define his role in everything that followed. As the cosmos steadied and divine order took its first stable breath, one question lingered in the spaces between starlight and silence. What happens when order must be maintained, not merely created? This question would become Thoth's eternal work, and through that work it would become Egypt's inheritance. The oldest temple inscriptions never say when Thoth arrived. They say when he began counting. That distinction matters more than the priests who carved those texts may have initially intended, because if something can count before time exists, then time itself is not fundamental. It is constructed. It is measured into being. And somewhere in the silence before the first dawn, someone or something decided what a moment would mean. The pyramid texts describe a state before differentiation. Up and down had no reference points. Left and right were meaningless because space itself had not yet committed to direction. None the primordial waters was not truly water. In any sense, we understand water. It was the potential for everything suspended in a state that the Egyptians understood not as chaos, but as unresolved possibility. The potential without actualization. Most cosmologies imagine creation as violence, as rupture, as an explosion or a divine combat that forces order from disorder. But Egyptian texts suggest something stranger, something more difficult to conceptualize. They suggest creation as recognition, as if reality was always there, waiting to be noticed, waiting for something intelligent enough to observe it into coherence. Thoth did not shape the first sunrise. He measured it. He did not command the stars into their courses. He mapped them. And in that mapping, in that first act of sustained attention, the universe began to understand what it had become, to know itself through being witnessed by consciousness. This is cosmology as epistemology. The universe knows itself through being observed, and consciousness is the means of that self-knowing. The coffin. Texts preserve a curious phrase that appears in several variations. Thoth, they say, came forth from himself, not born, not created, came forth as if he had always existed, folded within the fabric of potential, until awareness itself unfolded into presence. The texts never explain what triggered that unfolding. They only confirm it happened before anything else could become fixed. Before the first distinction was drawn, the first line was written, the first count began. There is something deeply unsettling about this sequence of events. If intelligence emerged before form, then consciousness is not a product of the universe. It is a prerequisite for the universe to stabilize at all. This inverts the common assumption that consciousness is a late development, something that emerged after matter and energy had already sorted themselves into complex arrangements. Instead, the Egyptians suggest something reversed. That structure itself requires consciousness. That matter cannot cohere into stable form without something observing it, measuring it, recording it, holding it in place through sustained attention. This is not poetic metaphor. This is presented as cosmological fact. The authority to determine truth. The earliest divine councils recorded in temple mythology show the gods gathering to assign roles, territories, and responsibilities. Ra would govern the sun's journey across the heavens. Geb would hold the earth. Nut would arch herself across the heavens in her eternal posture of cosmic support. Shu would separate them, maintaining the space that allowed both to exist without merging. But Thoth received no territory, no domain of matter or force. Instead, he was given something more fundamental: the authority to determine what was true, to establish the criteria by which truth could be distinguished from falsity, to maintain Ma'at not as a law imposed on reality from outside, but as reality's inherent structure. Truth was not obedience to a divine command imposed from on high. Truth was alignment with what is. And Thoth's role was to preserve the clarity that allowed that alignment to be perceived. In the Hall of the Two Truths at Hermopolis, where Thoth's primary cult center would eventually rise, priests copied texts describing his first act after receiving this cosmic authority. He established Ma'at not as a law imposed on reality, but as reality's inherent structure. The distinction is subtle but critical. It means that order is not arbitrary. It is intrinsic to existence. To act against Ma'at is not to break a rule imposed from outside. It is to act against the very nature of reality itself. But here is where the texts begin to trouble themselves. Because if Ma'at is inherent, woven into the fabric of creation, why does it require protection? Why does it need a guardian? Why would the universe require constant maintenance if its structure is truly fundamental? The answer appears obliquely in later wisdom literature, not explicitly stated, but scattered throughout texts where careful readers can find it. Because consciousness can forget. Because even gods can lose sight of what they once knew. Because the first act of creation was not making order appear, but making it persist. Making it continue to hold itself in coherent form, despite the constant pressure of entropy, the perpetual tendency toward dissolution, the gravitational pullback toward the formless state from which all order emerged. Astronomical papyri from the New Kingdom show calculations that priests insisted were not invented, but remembered. Inherited from a time when the relationship between sky and earth was direct, unmediated, obvious. The angle of the sun at equinox, the rhythm of Sirius rising, the correlation between lunar months and Nile floods. These were not discoveries in the modern sense. The text suggests they were recoveries of what Thoth had established at the beginning. And if that is true, then something was lost. Some direct knowledge that required reconstruction. Some initial clarity that had already begun to fade within the span of a few generations after creation had stabilized. The universe was already vulnerable to forgetting, already leaning toward entropy, already requiring effort to maintain what had been freely given at the start. The invention of permanence. The Greek historian Plutarch, writing about Egyptian theology centuries later, recorded a strange detail from the priests at Thebes. Thoth invented writing they told him not to preserve knowledge that humanity had gained and might forget, rather to prevent knowledge already possessed from slipping away. Writing in this interpretation was not progress toward a future capability. It was a defense against forgetting, which means the cosmos, at the moment of its stabilization, was already vulnerable, already leaning toward entropy, already requiring effort to maintain what had been freely given at the start. Thoth's first act, then, was not creation. It was maintenance. He was not the architect of the universe's structure. He was the caretaker of an architecture already present, but perpetually at risk of collapsing back into formless potential. The question no temple text dares answer directly is this: if order requires constant vigilance, constant record, constant remeasurement, then was creation ever truly finished? Or is the universe still balanced on the edge between coherence and dissolution, held in place only by a God who never stops watching? Are we living in stable reality, or in the first eternal moment of creation, perpetually requiring maintenance? The pyramid texts end their account of the primordial age with a phrase that appears nowhere else in Egyptian literature. And Thoth spoke the first number, not the first word, not the first name, the first number, as if counting itself was the spell that bound reality into endurance, as if numerical order was the incantation that prevented the universe from dissolving. The civil calendar of ancient Egypt contained exactly 365 days, no adjustments, no leap years, and every 4 years, imperceptibly at first, then increasingly obvious over decades and centuries, it drifted one day further from the solar year. A mismatch that the priests understood perfectly. They had the mathematical sophistication to calculate the discrepancy. They had the authority to implement correction. They never did. This was not ignorance. This was intention. And the intention becomes clear only when you understand the full complexity of the calendar system the Egyptians maintained. Alongside that imperfect civil calendar, they maintained a second system, a lunar calendar of 354 days that tracked religious festivals with precision tied to the moon's phases. And beneath both of these, inscribed in temple astronomy charts and preserved in papyri, lay a third system. The Thothic calendar anchored to the Heliac rising of Sirius, which aligned perfectly with the Nile's flood cycle every 460 years. 3 calendars, 3 different counts, all maintained simultaneously for millennia. The question historians rarely ask is why? Why would a civilization capable of astronomical precision deliberately use an imperfect calendar for civil purposes while reserving accuracy for sacred observation? The answer exists in the texts themselves, though quietly. The temple inscriptions at Edfu describe Thoth not as the inventor of time, but as its regulator, the divine intelligence who determined which cycles mattered, which rhythms required attention, which measurements would preserve cosmic order. He did not create the sun's movement. He calibrated how humanity would relate to it. He did not determine that the Nile would flood. He established the framework by which that flooding could be anticipated, counted, and used to stabilize civilization. The knowledge that precedes discovery, the Rind mathematical papyrus, copied around 1600 BC, but claiming to derive from much more ancient writings, contains geometric calculations for areas, volumes, and proportions. Problem 51 asks scribes to calculate the area of a circular field using a method that approximates pi to 3.16, remarkably close to the actual value of 3.141559. But the papyrus offers no explanation for why this specific approximation was chosen. No derivation, no proof, only the instruction. This is the procedure, as if the knowledge predated the need to justify it, as if someone had discovered the principle long ago and transmitted it as received wisdom, not as something that required explanation because it was simply how things were known to work. Temple architecture reveals the same pattern. The proportions of the hypostyle hall at Karnak, the spacing between columns, the height of the ceiling, the relationships between interior and exterior dimensions. All of these follow mathematical ratios that appear nowhere in surviving instructional texts. The builders knew the proportions without needing to explain them. They measured reality as Thoth had measured it, not by invention, by recognition. The astronomical ceiling at Dendera Temple shows the night sky as it appeared around 50 BC with constellations positioned according to observations that required tracking stellar movements across centuries. But embedded in that ceiling are notations suggesting the chart itself was a copy of an older diagram, which was itself a copy of something earlier still. How far back does this chain of copying extend? How many times has this single chart been reproduced, each generation of priests copying the work of their predecessors? The Egyptians believed that Thoth had given them the original measurements, the first angles, the first ratios, the first counts that allowed the visible world to align with cosmic structure. And their responsibility was not to improve upon those measurements or to innovate beyond them. Their responsibility was to preserve them exactly as they had been revealed, to copy them faithfully, to maintain them across generations, despite the constant pressure of entropy, the tendency toward error, the natural human impulse to improve or modify based on contemporary understanding. This introduces a troubling possibility that Egyptian science was not progressive. It was conservative, not advancing toward discovery, but maintaining what had been known at the beginning, and was perpetually at risk of degradation through forgetting or deliberate alteration. The Great Pyramid at Giza, built around 2500 BC, encodes the ratio of its height to its base perimeter as exactly 2p. This mathematical relationship appears nowhere in surviving mathematical texts from that era. The builders either possessed geometric knowledge they never bothered to write down, or they inherited proportions without fully understanding the principles behind them. Both options are unsettling. Both suggest knowledge flowing backward from some initial clarity rather than forward through gradual discovery. The burden of preserved knowledge. Thoth's role, as described in the pyramid texts, was to observe the universe's inherent structure and make it legible to divine and human consciousness. The sun did not need Thoth to rise. The laws governing celestial motion required no witness for them to function. But without Thoth, no one would know when the sun would rise or why that mattered, or how to structure ritual agriculture and governance around its reliable return. The Nilometers carved into temple walls at Elephantine Island measured flood levels with precision that allowed priests to predict crop yields months in advance. But the inscriptions beside those measurements describe them as confirmations of patterns Thoth had established at creation. Patterns that would hold as long as they were properly observed. Patterns that would fail if the observation ceased or if the measurement became careless. Measurement in this framework was not merely practical, it was ontological. To measure correctly was to align with the universe's underlying order. To measure incorrectly, or to stop measuring entirely, was to invite the slow dissolution of structure back into formless potential. The universe could not be taken for granted. It required vigilance. It required care. The Greek philosopher Plato, after visiting Egypt and studying with the priests, wrote that the Egyptians distinguished between two types of knowledge. Techne, the skill of making things the practical capability, and episteme, the understanding of why things are as they are, the deeper comprehension of principles. He claimed the Egyptians prioritized the second, that their priests sought not to manipulate reality, but to comprehend its eternal principles. If true, then Thoth was not a god of innovation. He was a god of maintenance. The intelligence that prevented cosmic law from being forgotten, distorted, or abandoned in the pursuit of more convenient alternatives. But even perfect measurement has a vulnerability. Numbers can be recorded, angles can be copied, cycles can be charted. Yet all of this depends on one fragile prerequisite: that someone remembers what the numbers mean, that the charts are interpreted correctly, that the knowledge survives from one generation to the next without degradation. Order without memory is merely coincidence waiting to scatter. And memory itself, as the Egyptians would soon discover, needed a guardian even more vigilant than the one who measured time. The Egyptian language had one word for to write and a completely different word for to make permanent. But in hieroglyphic texts, both actions used the same symbol. This was not linguistic economy, this was theology. Because to the scribes who carved those symbols into temple walls, writing was not transcription, it was transformation. The act of inscribing something shifted it from the realm of the spoken, ephemeral, vulnerable mortal into the realm of the eternal. A word spoken could be forgotten. The voice carries the words, and then silence returns. The words dissolve, But to write something, to inscribe it in permanent form, to create marks that would endure after the speaker had died, this was to transform the temporary into the eternal. The power of written truth. The earliest hieroglyphs appear around 3200 BC on ceremonial palettes and tomb inscriptions. But they arrive without ancestors. There is no evidence of gradual development, no primitive stage where symbols are clumsy or uncertain. The Narmer palette, one of the oldest known examples, displays hieroglyphs that are already sophisticated, standardized, syntactically complete. Egyptologists describe this as the writing system emerging fully formed, which is a curious phrase because in the history of human technology, nothing emerges fully formed. Tools evolve, languages develop, systems become complex over generations of trial and error, unless, of course, they are not invented but received, unless they are transmitted from an earlier source, already mature, already functional. The pyramid texts credit Thoth with the creation of hieroglyphs, describing them not as human innovation, not as cultural development, but as a divine gift. And the gift was specific. Not merely the ability to communicate across distance or time, not just practical functionality, but the capacity to bind truth into unchanging form, to make permanent what would otherwise dissolve. Writing in this framework was cosmic stabilization made visible. It was the mechanism by which Thoth's work continued after his direct presence had withdrawn from human consciousness. Every inscription was an act of cosmic maintenance. Every careful transcription was participation in the work of preserving creation itself. But here is the detail that complicates everything. Certain hieroglyphs were forbidden to be written in certain contexts. The symbols for dangerous animals, snakes, scorpions, crocodiles, were often drawn incomplete, missing their tails, missing their legs, as if the full representation might activate what it depicted, as if the symbol and the thing symbolized were not entirely separate, as if a perfectly written image of a serpent might, through the power of the written word, bring an actual serpent into being. Some tomb inscriptions omit the glyph entirely, replacing it with a benign substitute. Why would a civilization treat symbols as if they possessed independent power? What fear or understanding underlay this caution? The instruction of Thutmose. One of the oldest pieces of wisdom literature describes writing as making a house for words so they cannot die. The metaphor is precise. Just as a house protects a body from the elements, writing protects meaning from the erosion of forgetfulness, misunderstanding, and time. Scribal training in ancient Egypt lasted over a decade. Students copied the same classic texts repeatedly, not merely to memorize them, though that happened incidentally, but to internalize the act of writing as ritual. Not as technical skill, but as spiritual discipline. The hand learning the correct form. The mind learning to think like those who wrote the originals. The consciousness learning to align with the principles encoded in the sacred texts through the act of reproducing them exactly. The satirical letter of Hori, a New Kingdom text, mocks an incompetent scribe. But the mockery is not directed at poor handwriting. It is directed at a fundamental failure of understanding. The letter states that the scribe stands at the right hand of Ra. That literacy was participation in divine order. That to write correctly was to cooperate with the cosmic principle that maintained creation. The eternal question. Temple archives at Karnak and Abydos contained vast libraries of papyrus scrolls meticulously organized and protected by priesthoods whose primary duty was preservation, not interpretation. These were not public records available to casual browsing. Access was restricted to those who had undergone initiation, to those who understood that knowledge inscribed carried weight beyond its content, that the act of preserving knowledge was not separate from the content being preserved, but integral to it. Here is a detail that reframes our understanding of ancient Egyptian thought. The Egyptians maintained separate archives for the same information. One set of records was functional: land surveys, grain tallies, administrative orders, the practical knowledge needed to run a civilization. But another set was sacred. The true record, as they called it, copied with ceremonial precision and stored in innermost temple chambers, accessible only to the highest ranks of initiated priests. The sacred texts were rarely consulted for practical purposes. They existed, the priests insisted, to anchor reality itself, to maintain the cosmic order through the act of preservation. Which raises an unbearable question. Were the sacred texts preserving what happened, or were they, by existing, by being maintained, by being copied carefully, by being protected, causing what happened to remain stable? Were the records describing reality, or were they sustaining it? Was the distinction between record and incantation not merely blurred, but actually meaningless? By the Middle Kingdom, scribes had become a distinct class, not aristocrats in the traditional sense, not priests in the formal hierarchical sense, but something in between, a new category of human. The satire of the trades praises the scribal profession above all others. Farmers toil in the sun and suffer in the fields. Soldiers endure hardship and danger. Craftsmen strain against resistant materials. But the scribe, the text states, sets in order the affairs of Egypt. The verb used, seaman, carries connotations of cosmic arrangement. The same term applied to Thoth's ordering of creation, to place in order, to establish hierarchy, to organize the chaos of existence into comprehensible form. Scribes were stewards of continuity. They ensured that what had been measured, observed, and understood in one generation would not dissolve into approximation or myth in the next. Their work was not scholarship in the modern sense. It was cosmic maintenance. But the power to preserve is also the power to alter. To write something is to give it permanence. But whose version, whose truth? The same technology that protected knowledge from forgetting could also enshrine error, propaganda, or selective omission as eternal fact. By the New Kingdom, royal inscriptions regularly rewrote history. Defeats became victories. Unpopular pharaohs were erased from king lists. Entire reigns vanished from the record as if they had never occurred. And because the records were sacred, because writing was believed to bind reality, because the Egyptians understood that to inscribe something was to make it real. In the deepest sense, these alterations were not merely political. They were ontological edits. Attempts to change what had been by changing what was written. The scribes knew this tension intimately. Their training texts warned against false words set in stone, against the scribe who makes lies eternal. Because if writing could bind truth, it could also bind falsehood, and the universe they feared might not know the difference. The mechanism by which truth was preserved had become a weapon. Knowledge had to be guarded not just from forgetting, but from corruption. Memory had a guardian, but the guardian was a mortal fallible and increasingly political. And balance for the first time in these carefully maintained records began to strain under the weight of that knowledge.